Some people have never been abroad, and it is oftentimes really difficult for them to understand that different places in the world can have vastly different ways of doing things. These so-called cultural differences also inevitably find their way into media in the form of books, movies, and even video games. It is to little surprise that the term culture describes not just the manners of people, but also their history and works of art. The Yakuza series is thus one that some could naively describe as Grand Theft Auto, but in Japan. While there are similarities in the structures of the games, this statement could not be further from the truth. There really are only two things these series have in common: a plot following the life of a criminal, and a complete overabundance of minigames. In this video, I will be going into the cultural aspects of Yakuza 0 and see how the Japanese way of life shaped the creation of this title. This should also give rise to the answer on why we Westerners perceive the Yakuza series to be a bit weird. Let's start with something completely obvious: the visuals and the design of the world. It doesn't take a genius to see that Yakuza 0 and GTA 5 approached the design of the world completely differently. Just saying that, though, would simply be stating the obvious, so let's go a bit deeper. The world in Yakuza 0 is basically completely made up of a few smaller and completely walkable cities. All of the locations, shops, minigames are all very close to one another and take up only very little space. In contrast, the world of Los Santos in GTA 5 is absolutely massive. All the relevant locations are blocks apart with a lot of filler such as homes, lawns, or office buildings put in between. In turn, this requires traversal by faster means than by foot, and due to this, it is usual for Western games allowing you to simply steal and take off with any car that happens to be around. If that were not the case, traversal would become much more difficult in these larger worlds. The players would get bored. Being able to take any vehicle in Western games is thus a necessary consequence of the world design. The character is unable to take any vehicle in Yakuza 0, simply because there is no need to. When you work in a creative field, you usually take inspiration from things familiar to you. Western developers will thus create the massive spaced out cities that they walk and drive in every day. Japanese developers will in turn do the same with their own experiences. Imagine you walking and living in a city where everything is within walkable distances, and you barely ever use your car. How would you design the city of your game? Unless you're an absolute car enthusiast, you would most likely end up designing a walkable city as well. But the biggest question is now left to answer. Why do the cities of America and Japan differ so much? Here is where the cultures of each respective nation comes in. Culture is an interesting concept, as it not only influences the things its people do, but is also influenced in return. In this case here, the different styles of city architecture originate from the vast differences in landmass available to the Americans and the Japanese. As long as you've ever looked at a world map once in the last 10 years, you should know that Japan is a lot smaller than the USA. Comparing the populations and landmasses of the respective countries, we can see that in Japan around 10 times more people need to fit into the same space as in the USA. This difference in available space resulted in two vastly different sets of zoning laws, and here is where the interesting stuff begins. Zoning laws are a set of laws a government decides upon that determine which types of buildings can be built in which plots of land. Have you ever wondered why there are designated residential zones where people live and industrial zones where factories and warehouses are situated? Wouldn't it be much better for commuting if people could instead live right next to the factories? Yes, but that would also reduce the quality of living for those around the factories. Your local government regulates where these buildings can and cannot be placed, and in general, they care about the quality of life of its citizens and try to separate these zones as much as possible. In a country with a lot of space, such as the USA, this task is easily accomplished. The zoning laws are very strict. These laws even dictate how you have to build your buildings, for example by requiring you to leave space between your house and the border of your lot. If you own a business, you might even have to supply a certain number of parking spots. Japan, on the other hand, is quite unrestrictive. You see so many houses tightly squeezed next to each other, because there are only few rules set in place on how you build your house once you own the lot. The zoning laws in Japan also set a tier list of different types of buildings. Residential districts are the highest on the list. You're only allowed to build residential buildings in those. In the industrial zones, however, which are also the lowest in the tier list, you're not only allowed to build industrial buildings, but also anything else higher in the list. Any industrial zone can therefore contain any type of building, including shops that are in the medium tier and homes for people, the very highest tier. A small shop can even be built in residential areas, making a shopping trip accessible by foot for people living in a typical suburban environment. The advantages of these kind of zoning laws are particularly profound in the fact that Japan's cities are completely walkable. Building homes right in the middle of industrial or business zones results in greatly reduced commutes. This in turn means that people don't require as many cars or roads. Less roads means more space can be used for buildings, and thus people are more easily able to live closer together, and thus closer to places of interest. This established the culture of walking in Japan, and in turn led the designers of Yakuza 0 to create a city entirely traversable by walking, and also without the ability to drive a car. We see here at this point how the properties of a country affect its culture. And now, the culture of walking in Japan creates a situation where things can't be built far away from another, simply because the people don't have the cars to do so. This is in stark contrast to the USA. Zoning laws are very restrictive and businesses need to dedicate land space to things such as parking. This increase in space taken up means that people live further away from each other, and this in turn results in more cars being needed. With more cars on the roads, more roads need to be made. Those roads take up space for actual buildings, pushing people further apart, resulting in even more cars being needed, and so forth. As we can see, the culture of a country and its properties are a feedback loop, and the result of this feedback loop we're able to observe in our everyday life, and through the virtue of inspiration, also in our games. As we all know, the culture of a country has absolutely zero effect on the gameplay of a game developed within it. Psych. It's exactly the opposite. Like I said earlier, driving is basically non-existent in this game, in a stark contrast to Western games. But another huge difference exists. Guns. Yakuza 0 is basically void of guns. Their occurrences are uncommon, and combat is exclusively melee. There is a big reason why Japanese games enjoy a notable absence of guns, while Western games are completely dominated by them. Call of Duty, Battlefield, Far Cry, and now also Fortnite. Those are some of the biggest brands out here in gaming. And the reason for that is simply put, culture. The USA and Europe have a deep history when it comes to arms. Back when Europeans all hated each other, the centuries of wars spurred on an arms race. This then inevitably led the European nations to become the dominant military forces in the entire world. The invention of small and portable guns occurred during this arms race. Rifles and guns thus became established in European culture and subsequently in the inherited American culture as well. Nowadays, guns are very predominant in America, much more than in Europe. The Fourth Amendment comes to mind. How come? Quite simple. In all the conflicts that America engaged with, guns were always a part of it. Thus, when children learn about their country in history class, a painting of riflemen will always accompany that lesson. This shapes the mind of the American student, and once it comes to his turn to create games, he will draw inspiration from those history lessons. This is the exact opposite to what occurred in Japan. Gunpowder and cannons were introduced by the Chinese in the 13th century. However, they saw very little use. Portuguese firearms were introduced later in 1543 and saw strong development and use for the rest of that century. This came to a sudden stop during the period of isolation, which is also known as Sakoku. Only in 1853, when Japan started to open itself up to the world, and also to the conflicts of that time, did firearms become more widespread again. But once again, this lasted only for another 100 years, until the defeat of Imperial Japan in the Second World War. From that point on, a pacifist culture has been imposed on Japan by the Americans, and this holds on until today. In total, Japan was only exposed to firearms for 200 years in a history that can be traced back to 13,000 AD. this is a tiny fraction of the entire history of Japan, and it becomes clear why the Japanese people put so little significance on firearms. The culture of Japan is thus practically indifferent to guns. Larger importance is instead given to concepts such as loyalty, hierarchy, and accountability. It is of little surprise that the cutscenes in Yakuza 0 often show these exact concepts, with accountability standing out particularly. The punishment for making a mistake is usually to cut off one of your own fingers. But let's stop with the history for a little bit and look at the combat instead. The lack of influence of guns in the Japanese culture inspires its developers differently. The combat is entirely melee. You try and beat up your opponents. This can be done in multiple styles, which can be swapped to freely during each fight. Weapons can be equipped during the fight too, either in form of actual weapons or whatever happens to be lying around. Comparing this to a shooting game from the West, you might think that these are completely different styles of games. But there are a surprising number of similarities here. Players generally want variety in games. Shooters do that by providing a selection of different guns, such as pistols, assault rifles, and shotguns. While you can probably get by just by using one of them, a different weapon might be a more appropriate one for a certain situation. And exactly this occurs in Yakuza 0 with its fighting styles. These provide the aforementioned variety and give the player the tool sets for all kinds of situations. These similarities don't end here. There are also minigames and other intermissions from the main story, which improve the pacing and scope of the individual games. Whereas in GTA you would see a strip club. In Yakuza 0 you see hostess clubs. Hostess clubs are similar in concept to strip clubs. You pay to see a girl, but the key difference with hostess clubs is that they are strictly non-sexual. What I'm trying to get here at though, is despite the significant cultural differences between the West and Japan, we can see that games from both cultures come to solutions for good and well-paced games, in some cases also very similar ones. This is why it is so important to broaden your perspective and allow yourself to see things from a different point of view. Both the West and Japan have highly functioning modern societies, and this just shows that there is more than one way to solve a problem. When we find something weird, there must be an underlying process in our brains occurring, which makes us have that feeling. This feeling can be evoked by a number of things, and one of these is a lack of congruence. Congruence is a term that describes the fact that a situation occurs in an expected way. A lack of congruence causes suspicions. An example: why would you feel nervous when you're in a supermarket buying something? When you're just buying something, there shouldn't really be any reason to be nervous. Maybe, in this case, you are actually stealing a more expensive item and trying to hide that fact by buying a cheaper one. This nervousness is an indication of something going on and can be spotted by detectives, which will in turn question you on what you're really doing. How this relates to Yakuza is that the game is in fact very incongruent. The main story of the game is very serious. However, the side missions of the game are the exact opposite of that. For example, side missions include parts like pretending to be a producer at a movie set, where you are then challenged on your knowledge of movie terminology. Another one was training a very shy novice dominatrix to do her job better. You wouldn't want to visit a dominatrix that is submissive and apologetic, right? And the most important side mission of them all, get a young boy's video game back, which was stolen with him by a slightly bigger boy. And don't forget the minigames either. This quick and drastic change of the tone of the story is what we find weird, and I'll explain to you why now. In Western culture, comedy and seriousness is generally separated from each other. We have both serious books, movies and games such as Call of Duty. Okay, bad example. Better examples would be Games of Thrones or the recent God of War. Then we also have our fun stuff like Deadpool or The Naked Gun. There is little stuff in between, and I don't mean the quick comic relief that Marvel movies use to ease attention in the movies. Comic relief doesn't really change the tone of the movie or game. It is simply used to ease tension. This is used in Yakuza 0 too. For example, at one point in the story, the character's goal it is to assassinate someone. He breaks into a chiropractor's office, but is then caught off guard by a blind masseuse. To avoid being discovered as a thief, he pretends to have serious back pain and agrees to a massage treatment. That's the comic relief. It lasts for a little while and eases the tension after a short conversation with a masseuse. The mood hastily returns to a serious one when the office's boss returns, ready to fight you. Seriousness and comedy is usually strictly separated. This separation thus means that Westerners are unfamiliar with a piece of media that is both serious and light-hearted at the same time. We experience this unfamiliarity as weirdness. To our minds, it simply makes no sense. To us, a serious game has to be serious, and a light-hearted game has to be light-hearted as well. A failure to do so gives us a feeling of weirdness and incongruence. This is, however, not the case in the Japanese culture. It seems that a medium over there can both be serious and at the same time light-hearted, without it being weird. Unfortunately though, I am unable to explain on why that is. Perhaps it has to do with the dislike of directness in Japanese culture. The Japanese people prefer to avoid confrontation, and are thus averse to direct statements that could potentially offend anyone. It might be this reason for the Yakuza games to constantly throw in something easygoing, as to make sure to avoid overwhelming anyone with something too serious. It might as well just be that a specific reason is undeducible. The way their culture developed just turned out that way. I want to avoid saying here that this weirdness is bad. It may even be a good thing, as it is something new that offers a refreshing experience. The director of the Yakuza series recently even said that the Yakuza games are successful in the West, precisely because they do not cater to Western tastes. I generally find the concepts and the culture of games very interesting, and seeing so many things in Yakuza 0 that felt familiar, but also foreign, was intriguing. The different architectural styles between the West and Japan are caused by differences in zoning laws. These are in turn caused by the different amount of available space. Both Western and Japanese city design have their advantages and disadvantages. Knowing them is key to making a successful game. The lack of firearms in the history of Japan resulted in guns being practically absent in the mindshare of the Japanese people. Japanese games are thus not designed with them in mind, and instead focus on close combat, bare-armed or weaponized. In the case of RPGs, magic is also thrown in. The Yakuza series seems weird and incongruent to us, because we are unfamiliar with the tone and atmosphere constantly switching between serious and lighthearted. Is that caused by the dislike of directness by the Japanese people? I don't know, but I hope to find out more in my abroad stay in Japan very soon. Overall, I enjoyed Yakuza 0. Making this video showed me how different cultures and thus different perspectives can create different results. But both results work. Japanese games and Western games all have the potential to be great games. Analyzing what it is that makes both respective approaches work is the key to create interesting and unique experiences in the future. So go out and try Yakuza 0. For just $20 on both PC and PS4 right now, you can get a fantastic experience that is absolutely worth its price. Hey, what's up, and thank you so much for watching this video. A tremendous amount of effort goes into making it, and I really hope that you can appreciate that. So, if you like this video, consider supporting this tiny channel by subscribing and leaving a thumbs up on the video. Also, I'd be super happy to hear thoughts on the video, so make sure to leave a comment down below. If you really want to support this channel, I'd be really happy if you could take a look at another one of my videos. I recently made a video on the Crash Bandicoot trilogy, where I go into nostalgia and how that affects the enjoyment of the video game. So, I guess that's it. Thank you very much for watching again, and I really hope to see you next time.